This is a fictional story inspired by real-life situations. No real event, just a powerful lesson. The afternoon was calm. The road wasn't busy. No sirens. No noise. Just the low hum of traffic and the sound of tires rolling against asphalt. Steven Seagal rode his bike slowly, comfortably, like a man with nowhere to rush and nothing to prove. No bodyguards. No flashy clothes. Just a black jacket, jeans, and quiet confidence. To anyone watching, he looked like just another middle-aged biker enjoying his day. Then suddenly, red and blue lights flashed behind him. Steven glanced back, sighed softly, and pulled over without hesitation. A police cruiser stopped. The door swung open. The officer stepped out with a sharp attitude already written on his face. He didn't greet Steven. Didn't ask politely. His eyes scanned Steven from head to toe, the bike, the clothes, the calm expression. And he smirked. "License," the cop snapped. Steven calmly reached for his pocket. Before he could even speak, the officer stepped closer. "What's the rush?" the cop said sarcastically. "Trying to show off on this old bike?" Steven looked up, relaxed. "No, officer," he replied evenly. "I was just riding through." That calm tone irritated the cop. He circled Steven like a predator, tapping the bike with his boot. "You people always say that," the officer muttered. A few pedestrians slowed down. Someone stopped at the corner. A couple across the street watched quietly. Steven handed over his license. The cop barely glanced at it. Instead, he scoffed. "You think riding around here makes you special? You don't belong on this road." Steven frowned slightly, not in anger, but confusion. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked. That question flipped a switch. The officer suddenly stepped forward and shoved the bike hard. Steven lost balance. The bike slid out from under him. He hit the pavement. Hard. Gasps echoed. A woman covered her mouth. A man shouted, "Hey!" The bike clattered across the road. Steven sat up slowly, absorbing the moment, dust on his jacket, his hand scraped, his bike damaged. The officer stood over him. "Get up," he barked. "Stop acting like a victim." Phones came out instantly. Steven looked around, at the shocked faces, the recording cameras, the officer towering over him. He didn't shout. Didn't threaten. He simply stood up, picked up his bike, and dusted himself off. Then he looked the officer straight in the eyes and said calmly, "There was no reason for that." The cop laughed. "Oh, there absolutely was," he replied. "You just don't know it yet." And that's when everyone standing there felt it. This wasn't over. Because the officer had no idea who he had just pushed off that bike. Steven stood there quietly, holding his bike upright as if nothing had happened. The scrape on his hand stung. Dust clung to his jacket. But his expression stayed calm, almost unreadable. The officer didn't like that. Most people would be angry, embarrassed, scared. Steven was none of those. The cop took a step closer, invading his space. "You think this is funny?" the officer snapped. "Standing there like you didn't just get put in your place?" Steven adjusted the bike and replied evenly. "I didn't resist. I didn't argue. You pushed me for no reason." That sentence hit the officer like an insult. His jaw tightened. "For no reason," he laughed loudly. "I decide the reason." A few bystanders exchanged uneasy looks. Someone whispered, "This is getting out of hand." The officer raised his voice, making sure everyone could hear. "You bikers think you own the road. No respect. No discipline." Steven looked at him carefully. "Respect goes both ways," he said calmly. "That was a mistake." The officer slammed a hand on the bike's handle. "Don't lecture me," he growled. "You're already one wrong move away from cuffs." A man across the street pulled out his phone. Then another. Within seconds, multiple cameras were recording. The officer noticed, and instead of calming down, he puffed his chest. "Good," his posture said. "Let them watch." "You see this?" he barked at Steven. "This is what happens when you don't know your place." Steven didn't raise his voice. "I'm cooperating," he said. "There's no need to escalate." The word escalate irritated the officer. "Oh, you want escalation?" He stepped back and pointed aggressively. "Hands where I can see them." Stephen slowly placed his hands away from the bike, fully visible. No sudden movements. No resistance. The crowd watched closely now. A woman shook her head. A teenager whispered, "Why is he acting like that?" The officer paced back and forth, enjoying the attention. "You know what your problem is," he said. "You think staying calm makes you smart." Stephen met his eyes. "No," he replied. "I stay calm because anger makes things worse." That calmness was fuel to the fire. The officer leaned in and said quietly, dangerously close, "You don't tell me how this goes." Stephen could feel the tension thick in the air. Cars slowed. People stopped walking. Everyone sensed it. This wasn't about traffic. This wasn't about a routine stop. This was about control. Stephen took a breath. "Officer," he said carefully, "I just want to continue my ride." The cop smirked. "You're not going anywhere until I say so." He turned toward the crowd and shouted, "Back up. Give us space." But the phones stayed up. Recording. Capturing every word. The officer noticed one man holding his phone steady. "You," the cop snapped. "Stop recording." The man replied nervously, "I'm allowed to." The officer hesitated, just for a second. Stephen noticed it. Power cracks when witnesses appear. Stephen spoke again, calm but clear. "No one's causing trouble here," he said. "Let's keep this professional." For a brief moment, the officer looked uncertain. Then pride took over. He stepped closer, pointing a finger at Stephen's chest. "You think you're special? You think these people will save you?" Stephen didn't flinch. "I think actions matter," he said. Silence. The crowd held its breath. Have you ever seen authority abused like this in public? Comment below where you're watching from. The officer straightened up, eyes burning. "All right," he said coldly. "Let's see how calm you stay next." And with that, the tension crossed a line. One that couldn't be undone. The officer's tone changed. Not louder, colder. That was the part that made people uncomfortable. He stepped back and rested his hand near his belt, letting the gesture speak for itself. "Turn around," he ordered. Stephen didn't move immediately. Not because he was resisting, but because he wanted to be sure he heard correctly. "Is there a reason?" Stephen asked calmly. The officer's eyes narrowed. "I don't need to explain myself to you," he snapped. "Turn around." A murmur rolled through the crowd. Someone whispered, "This is too much." Another voice said, "He hasn't done anything." Stephen slowly turned his body slightly, not fully, keeping his hands visible. "I've complied with everything you asked," he said evenly. "There's no cause for this." The officer laughed, sharp and mocking. "Cause?" he scoffed. "I decide cause." That sentence landed heavy. A man near the curb shook his head. A woman pressed record closer, making sure her camera caught every word. The officer stepped behind Stephen and shoved his shoulder, not enough to knock him down, but enough to send a clear message. "Stop testing me." Stephen stumbled one step forward, then steadied himself. He closed his eyes briefly. Not in fear. In control. The crowd felt it, something restrained, something coiled. Stephen turned his head slightly. "I'm asking you," he said quietly, "to stop putting your hands on me." The officer leaned in close, his voice low and venomous. "Or what?" That question echoed louder than any shout. Stephen didn't answer. He simply stood there, grounded, balanced, calm. That silence infuriated the officer. He grabbed Stephen's arm and twisted it slightly, forcing him to turn more. Gasps erupted. "Hey!" someone yelled. "That's not right." Stephen winced, not from pain, but from the disrespect. Still, he didn't retaliate. He spoke slowly, carefully, as if every word mattered. "There are cameras," he said. "People are watching." The officer looked around. Phones. Dozens of them. For the first time, a flicker of hesitation crossed his face. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. "You think I'm scared of being recorded?" He raised his voice so everyone could hear. "Good. Let them see." He shoved Stephen again, this time harder. Stephen caught himself just in time. His bike scraped loudly across the pavement. The sound cut through the air like a warning. A young man stepped forward instinctively. "Man, that's enough." "Back up!" the officer shouted, pointing aggressively. "I said back up." The man froze. The crowd retreated a step, but they didn't leave. No one wanted to miss what was coming. Stephen straightened his jacket. His breathing remained steady. The officer circled him again, enjoying the imbalance. "You know what you look like," the officer said. "A washed-up biker pretending to be tough." A few people exchanged looks. Stephen finally turned fully toward him. "Insults won't change what you're doing," he said calmly. "And what you're doing is wrong." That word, wrong, snapped something. The officer's face reddened. He grabbed Stephen's jacket collar briefly, pulling him close. The crowd gasped loudly now. "This ends when I say it ends," the officer growled. Stephen met his eyes. Not angry. Not afraid. Focused. "You're crossing a line," Stephen said quietly. The officer released him abruptly, pushing him backward. Stephen stumbled but regained his footing. Silence fell. Even traffic noise seemed distant. Everyone sensed it. This was the moment where things usually explode. A punch. A shout. A disaster. But Stephen didn't move. He stood tall. Hands relaxed. Posture balanced. Not submissive. Not aggressive. Controlled. A woman whispered, almost in awe. "Why isn't he reacting?" The officer paced again, breathing heavier now. The attention, the cameras, the resistance without resistance. It was getting to him. "You think you're better than me," he snapped. Stephen shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "I think you're better than this." That sentence landed harder than any blow. The officer stopped pacing. For a split second, he looked unsure. Then pride rushed back in. He straightened up and said loudly, "All right. Enough games." He reached toward his radio. "I'm calling this in." The crowd stiffened. Someone whispered, "This is going to get bad." Stephen watched calmly. Inside, he knew something important. Once this went further, there would be no turning back. He took a slow breath and said one last thing. Not for the officer, but for everyone watching. "I won't fight you," he said clearly. "But I won't be humiliated either." The officer looked at him, jaw clenched. Then he pressed the radio button. And in that moment, every single person there realized this wasn't just a routine stop anymore. It was about to become something much bigger. The officer lowered his radio slowly. Not because he had changed his mind, but because something in the air had shifted. The crowd wasn't just watching anymore. They were studying. Stephen stood beside his fallen bike, calm and unmoving, like a man rooted to the ground. His jacket hung slightly open now, dusted from the pavement. His face showed no fear, only patience. That was when it happened. A man near the back of the crowd squinted, leaned forward, and tilted his head. "Hold on," he murmured. The woman next to him followed his gaze. "No way," she whispered. "That looks like—" Another voice cut in, louder this time. "Is that Steven Seagal?" The words moved through the crowd like electricity. Not shouted. Not announced. Whispered. Stephen didn't react. He kept his eyes on the officer, refusing to turn, refusing to acknowledge the murmurs. But the officer noticed. He saw heads turning, phones zooming in closer, people looking at Stephen differently. "What?" the officer snapped. "What's everyone staring at?" No one answered him directly. A teenager near the sidewalk looked at his phone screen, then at Stephen, then back at his screen again. "Bro," he said quietly, "I think that actually is him." The officer scoffed. "Yeah, right," he said loudly. "You people believe anything." He looked back at Stephen with renewed irritation. You think wearing a jacket and staying quiet makes you somebody? Stephen finally turned his head slightly, not toward the crowd, but toward the officer. I never said I was, he replied calmly. That answer only confused things further. Most people would have used it by now. The name, the fame, the escape. Stephen chose silence. The whispers grew. I've seen those movies. Martial arts guy, right? No way he'd act like this if he was fake. The officer's posture stiffened. His confidence, once loud and aggressive, began to wobble. He pointed toward the crowd. Enough, he shouted. This has nothing to do with any celebrity nonsense. But the crowd didn't pull back. They leaned in, watching closely now, recording more carefully. The officer turned back to Stephen. You think they'll protect you, he said, lowering his voice. You think a name saves you? Stephen met his eyes steadily. A name doesn't make someone deserving of respect, he said. How you treat people does. That line landed hard. Not dramatic. Not shouted. Honest. A woman near the front nodded slowly. Another man muttered, He's right. The officer clenched his jaw. He hated this part. When the power stopped feeling absolute. He took a step closer again, trying to reclaim the space. You're still just a guy on a bike, he said. And I can make this a very long day for you. Stephen didn't step back. He didn't step forward either. He stood his ground, balanced, calm, unshaken. Behind them, someone spoke louder than before. Officer, a middle-aged man said cautiously, maybe you should just let him go. The officer spun around. I didn't ask for advice. The man raised his hands. I'm just saying, this is being recorded. That did it. The officer looked around again. Phones everywhere. Angles. Zooms. Faces. For the first time, he felt exposed. Stephen noticed the shift immediately. Not as triumph. As danger. When pride feels threatened, it often reacts badly. Stephen spoke again, measured and careful. This doesn't need to get worse, he said. Let's de-escalate. The officer laughed sharply. De-escalate. You don't get to use that word. He paused, then added bitterly. Funny how calm you are now that people think you're somebody. Stephen shook his head slowly. I was calm before anyone recognized me. That sentence silenced the immediate area. The officer didn't respond. Because he couldn't. Pause for a second. If you were standing there watching this, what would you do? Would you step in, or keep recording? Backhand index pointing down. Comment your answer below. The officer took a step back, recalculating. He hadn't lost control, but he could feel it slipping. The crowd wasn't against him openly. Yeah. But they weren't with him either. Stephen bent down slowly and lifted his bike upright again, checking the bent pedal. A simple action. A human one. The officer watched closely, suspicious. You touch that bike again, he warned, and I'll consider it non-compliance. Stephen straightened up. I'm fixing what you knocked down, he said plainly. Another ripple through the crowd. Someone whispered, Man, he's handling this like a monk. The officer rubbed his face briefly, then straightened his uniform. He looked like a man standing at a crossroads. Double down, or back off. Pride chose for him. All right, he said loudly, forcing authority back into his voice. Let's clear something up right now. He stepped forward again, finger pointing. I don't care who you are. I don't care what movies you made. Out here, I'm in charge. Stephen nodded once. Then act like it, he replied calmly. That was it. The crowd collectively inhaled. The officer froze for a fraction of a second. Then his eyes hardened. He reached for his radio again. You're about to learn something, he said coldly. Stephen didn't flinch. He simply stood there. A calm figure surrounded by noise, cameras, and rising tension. And everyone watching could feel it now. The truth was close. And when it came out, someone was going to regret everything. The officer's finger hovered over the radio button. He didn't press it yet. Something had changed. Not in the crowd. In him. Stephen stood directly in front of him now, bike upright at his side, posture relaxed but unmovable. He wasn't posturing. He wasn't challenging. He was simply there. And somehow, that presence was heavier than shouting. "You think you're in control," the officer said, trying to reclaim dominance. "You're one command away from being on the ground again." Stephen took a slow breath. "No," he said quietly. "I think control isn't about force. It's about restraint." The officer scoffed loudly, but it sounded forced. The crowd leaned in. Phones stayed steady. No one interrupted. Stephen continued, calm and deliberate, not for the officer alone, but for everyone listening. "You stopped me without cause. You pushed me without reason. And now you're escalating because you feel challenged." The officer snapped back instantly. "I feel challenged. You're the one acting like you're above the law." Stephen shook his head slowly. "I followed every instruction," he replied. "I never raised my voice. I never resisted. And I never disrespected you." A man near the front nodded unconsciously. A woman whispered, "He's right." The officer heard it. His jaw tightened. "You don't get to put me on trial," the officer growled. "Not here." Stephen met his eyes. "I'm not," he said. "Your actions are." That sentence landed like a quiet explosion. The officer stepped back half a step before catching himself. He hadn't expected that. Authority expects fear, not reflection. The officer turned to the crowd, voice rising again. "Everyone needs to move back. This is an active police situation." No one moved. Not a single step. That silence was louder than defiance. Stephen spoke again, softer now. "This doesn't have to end badly," he said. "You can stop." The officer laughed sharply. "Stop. You think I'm backing down because a few people pulled out phones?" Stephen didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around at the crowd. The young man recording. The woman holding her phone with shaking hands. The elderly couple watching from across the street. Then he looked back at the officer. "I think you're not used to being seen," he said calmly. The officer's face flushed. That was it. That was the nerve. "You want to talk about being seen?" the officer snapped. "Let me show you what happens when someone pushes their luck." He stepped closer again, voice low and aggressive. "You don't scare me," he said. "Not your calm. Not your age. Not whatever image people think you have." Stephen didn't move. "Good," he replied. "Fear isn't respect." For a moment, neither man spoke. Cars passed slowly in the background. The hum of the city felt distant. Then Stephen said something no one expected. "You're better than this." The officer blinked. "What did you say?" "You're better than this," Stephen repeated calmly. "And so am I." That broke something. The officer looked away briefly, running a hand over his face. Then he straightened again, harder this time. "No," he said. "I don't need a lecture from you." He raised his voice, turning to the crowd again. "You think this guy's some hero? You think calm makes him innocent?" Stephen finally raised his voice slightly, not loud, but strong. "Calm keeps things from becoming violent," he said. "And violence is where this is headed if you don't stop." The crowd murmured. The officer spun back. "Are you threatening me?" Stephen shook his head. "I'm warning you." Silence fell again. Right now, whose side would you be on? The officer with authority, or the man choosing restraint? Backhand index pointing down, comment officer, or calm below. The officer exhaled sharply. Enough. He pressed the radio button. "Dispatch," he said, voice clipped. "I need another unit at my location." A wave of tension rolled through the crowd. Someone whispered, "Oh no!" Stephen closed his eyes briefly, just a second. Not in defeat. In acceptance. Once backup was called, there was no easy exit. The officer lowered the radio and looked at Stephen with renewed resolve. "Now," he said coldly, "we're doing this my way. Stephen opened his eyes and looked straight at him. "Then do it right," he replied. The officer hesitated, just for a heartbeat, because deep down, he knew something painful. This man wasn't trying to win. He was trying to end this. And that made him far more dangerous to the officer's pride than any threat. The crowd stayed silent, watching, recording, waiting. Somewhere in the distance, a siren began to approach. And everyone there understood one thing clearly now. The moment of truth was coming. And when it arrived, someone's authority was about to collapse. The siren grew louder. At first it was distant, a low wail blending into city noise. Then it became unmistakable. Backup was coming. The officer stood straighter, almost relieved. Reinforced. Whatever doubt had crept in was now buried beneath procedure and pride. Stephen remained still. Hands relaxed. Bike beside him. Eyes calm. The crowd parted slightly as another patrol car pulled up and stopped behind the first. Doors opened. 2 officers stepped out. One younger, alert. The other older, seasoned, observant. The senior officer scanned the scene quickly. The crowd. The phones. The tense silence. Then his eyes landed on Stephen. And everything changed. He stopped walking. His posture shifted instantly. His expression, once neutral, froze in recognition. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, quietly, almost disbelievingly, he spoke. "Mr. Seagal." The name didn't echo. It detonated. The crowd reacted all at once. Murmurs turned into gasps. "Wait, what? I knew it. That's actually him." Phones zoomed in harder now. The original officer turned sharply. "What?" he snapped. "What did you say?" The senior officer looked at him, then back at Stephen. "Yes," he said clearly. "That's Steven Seagal." Silence. Not a single sound from the crowd. The original officer felt it before he understood it, the ground shifting beneath him. He looked at Stephen again. Really looked this time. The face. The posture. The stillness. The realization hit him like cold water. His mouth opened. Closed. Then he laughed nervously. This some kind of joke," he said. "People pretend to be celebrities all the time." The senior officer didn't smile. "No," he replied firmly. "It's not a joke." Stephen finally spoke again. Still calm. Still steady. "I didn't want this to be about who I am," he said. "I wanted it to be about what happened." That sentence hurt more than any accusation. The original officer's face drained of color. He looked around. The crowd. The cameras. His partner. The senior officer watching him closely now. You should have said something," he muttered. Stephen shook his head slowly. "Why?" he asked. "So you'd treat me differently?" The officer didn't answer. Because the answer was obvious. The senior officer stepped forward. "Let's rewind," he said professionally. "Why was force used?" The original officer hesitated. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Words failed him. Stephen spoke instead. "You stopped me," he said evenly. "You pushed me off my bike. And you escalated when I stayed calm." The senior officer turned back to his colleague. "Is that accurate?" The officer swallowed hard. I thought he was resisting," he said weakly. A few people in the crowd scoffed openly. One voice said, "We saw everything." Another added, "It's all on video." The officer's shoulders slumped slightly. Reality had caught up. The senior officer exhaled slowly. "Step aside," he said. The original officer obeyed. That alone said everything. Stephen watched quietly as the authority he had been facing just minutes ago unraveled without him lifting a finger. The senior officer turned back to Stephen. "Are you injured, sir?" Stephen looked at his scraped hand. "Nothing serious," he replied. "But it didn't have to happen." The officer nodded. "I understand." He then turned toward the crowd. "Thank you for remaining calm," he said. "You're free to go." No one moved. They were watching the original officer now. He stood off to the side, eyes down, jaw tight, face burning. The senior officer walked over to him. "Badge," he said quietly. The officer looked up, shocked. "Here," he whispered. "Yes," came the reply. "Here." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as the officer unclipped his badge with shaking hands and placed it in the senior officer's palm. Stephen didn't smile. He didn't nod. He didn't celebrate. He simply watched. The senior officer turned back to Stephen. "I'm sorry," he said sincerely. "This doesn't reflect who we're supposed to be." Stephen met his eyes. "Then make sure it doesn't," he replied. The senior officer nodded. The crowd erupted then, not in cheers, but in applause. Not loud. Not wild. Respectful. Stephen lifted his bike, straightened the pedal, and prepared to leave. As he walked past the original officer, he stopped briefly. Not to threaten. Not to humiliate. Just to say one thing. "You had power," Stephen said quietly. "You didn't need to use it like that." Then he walked away. The officer stood frozen. Badge gone. Pride shattered. Lesson learned. Far too late. And every person watching knew one thing for certain. The moment Steven Seagal was revealed was the exact moment the cop instantly regretted everything. By the time Stephen rode away, the street no longer felt the same. People stood still, phones still raised, replaying what they had just witnessed. Not a fight, not an arrest, but something far rarer. A complete reversal of power. Within minutes, clips began spreading. First on local feeds. Then group chats. Then everywhere. Cop pushes calm biker, doesn't know who he is. This is how real strength looks. Watch till the end. By nightfall, the video was everywhere. Millions watched the same moment on repeat. The shove, the calm response, the growing tension, and finally, the reveal that changed everything. But what shocked people most wasn't who Stephen was. It was how he acted before anyone knew. Comment sections exploded. This proves respect shouldn't depend on status. The cop only changed when he realized who he was dealing with. That calm response was more powerful than any punch. News outlets picked it up the next morning. Not as celebrity drama. As a conversation. About authority. About restraint. About how quickly power can be abused, and how quietly it can be exposed. The police department released a statement within hours. An internal review. Immediate suspension. Body cam footage requested. A promise of accountability. The officer didn't appear in public that day. Or the next. His name trended briefly, then disappeared. But the lesson didn't. Stephen, on the other hand, said nothing. No interviews. No statements. No victory posts. Just one short message shared quietly through his team. True strength is knowing when not to use force. That single sentence was shared millions of times. People who had never seen his films before were now watching clips, not of action scenes, but of discipline. Martial artists reacted. Veterans responded. Everyday people shared their own stories. Stories of being judged. Of being pushed. Of being powerless in moments where no camera was around. And something unexpected happened. The video didn't just entertain. It changed behavior. People spoke up more. Bystanders stepped in sooner. Cameras didn't just record, they protected. Days later, Stephen was spotted riding again. Same bike. Same jacket. Same calm presence. Someone recognized him and called out, "Respect, man." Stephen nodded politely and kept riding. No speeches. No ego. Just movement forward. Because for him, the story had already ended. For everyone else, it had just begun. If you believe, respect should be given before status. Authority should protect, not intimidate. Real power is shown through control, not force. Backhand index pointing down, type respect in the comments. And if this story made you think, subscribe for more powerful fictional stories that reveal real-life lessons. Because sometimes, the strongest response is staying calm while the world is watching.